The attention economy for me includes print media, it includes our newspapers, it includes social media. I think it particularly includes, if you sit down of an evening to watch Netflix, that's social media. It's driving the same, it's going to the same kind of processes within your brain to suck you in. And the way that I describe the attention economy is it's the most recent frontier of colonization. The colonizer of this world, capitalism, has colonized all land. And, there are a few small pockets which we can see emerging at the moment that are trying to be colonized further, whether it's Greenland or Venezuela or whatever else. But ultimately, kind of, they've done it. The land has been overrun. And so the next frontier are our minds. And we're losing that battle. Our minds are being and have been colonized by the attention economy.
Hello. We are interviewing a great guest. His name's Rob Faure Walker. He's the author of Radical Young, that's coming out in late May. And it's just an incredible conversation we had about Jung. It's very hard for us to find Jungians that are as radical as us. So we're really excited to share this interview with Mr. Walker. And I want to tell you a little bit about him before we bring him on the show. Rob is an ecotherapist and author. He has previously worked as a teacher in schools in North and East London and as an academic at the University College London and SOAS University of London, where he founded systems to help academics provide the UK Parliament with research-based evidence to support lawmaking. His previous books have explored Western governments' misguided promotion of counter-extremism strategies and how to find loving transcendence while being forced to live in a transactional market economy. His coming book is called Radical Young, and it's going to be out in late May and explores healing through Gnostic introspection so that we can act better in the world. We talk about ecotherapy, we talk about the social media and the attention economy, and we also talk a little bit about psychedelics as well. So I hope you enjoy this interview that's beginning right. Hello, welcome Rob Faure Walker to the show. We're so excited to have you here. Wanted to just give you a chance to introduce yourself to the audience and tell a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name's Rob. I'm an academic and an author and also an ecotherapist. I suppose that's the main part of my work that we're talking about today. I work mostly in an ancient forest around where I live here in the south of England. And really kind of listening back to some of your podcasts, my work feels quite closely aligned to yours because I adopt a Jungian lens with my ecotherapy. I help my clients get into a state whereby aspects of their mind emerge within the forest around us, and then that gives us something to work with together. A great effect so far.
Awesome.
Sounds amazing.
And you have a new book coming out. We'll talk about that. It's called Radical Young. Can you tell us what made you write the book? I know you have some other books too.
Sure.
But why this book at this time?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess with anyone that's doing kind of writing about Jung, it's entirely personal in many aspects. That I have spent many years, firstly as a high school teacher and then as an academic in London, and I was quite involved in activist politics. That was always kind of part of my, both as a teacher working in a predominantly Muslim neighborhood and lobbying the government around their promotion or challenging their promotion of Islamophobia through some of their counterterrorism regimes. And then I developed that when I went into academia and did my PhD looking at similar kinds of things. And then latterly was kind of effective enough at that I was invited to other universities to train other academics in how to use their research to affect change mostly within the British Parliament, but within government systems generally. And, maybe not surprisingly, after 10, 15 years of doing that, certainly the lobbying work for about 10 years, I was pretty burnt out. So I kind of obviously, engaged in different kind of therapeutic modalities and was frustrated from a kind of an activist perspective that these processes of introspection could lead to some form of kind of political stasis. And that seemed to be kind of what was on offer, was like retreat from all of that active political work into yourself. And then what? And it didn't, and I didn't feel there was a huge amount of where do you go with that. And so I suppose I started writing the book and wanting to explore that process of recovery for myself through kind of deep psychology and dealing with the archetypal realm, but also to sort of to ask that further question of sort of heal so that we know how to act better, which felt like the bit that was missing for me when I was engaging in other forms of healing. And I think it's there in Jung's writing, but I don't feel it's sort of necessarily. I've tried to make it more overt, and it wasn't just for me because I mean it's sort of, as you mentioned previously, there are, whether you're in the States or anywhere in the world, we're bombarded by kind of apocalyptic experiences of climate change and war and all sorts. And so many people are overwhelmed. And particularly, many of my kind of fellow activists, political activists, I found were overwhelmed. And many of them were engaging with Jung as a way of healing. But equally, this was a sort of common theme that I was coming across. It wasn't just something that was lived by me. And so, yeah, so I set about writing the book. And I think I've written, this is my third book. And I think all of my books ultimately, perhaps slightly selfishly, I've kind of written for myself, but in the hope that there's kind of something in there that will help other people who, as we find out when you start doing this work on yourself, you find that, everyone else is experiencing this as well. And it can be overlaid. All of our experiences of the unconscious, self-evidently can be shared and used to help other people as well.
I love that. Yeah. From this kind of your perspective, right, which is very kind of socially aware and kind of a global perspective, and then kind of bringing in the Jungian perspective to it. Can you tell us a little bit about the social media aspect of this?
Yeah.
What is it doing to our mind body?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the way I describe it in the book is that social media, which sits within the attention economy, and I want to make that pretty broad. The attention economy for me includes print media, it includes our newspapers, it includes social media. I think it particularly includes, if you sit down of an evening to watch Netflix, that's social media. It's driving the same. It's going to the same kind of processes within your brain to suck you in. And the way that I describe the attention economy is it's the most recent frontier of colonization. The colonizer of this world, capitalism, has colonized all land.
Mm.
And, there are a few small pockets which we can see emerging at the moment that are trying to be colonized further, whether it's Greenland or Venezuela or whatever else. But ultimately, kind of, they've done it. The land has been overrun. And so the next frontier are our minds. And we're losing that battle. Our minds are being and have been colonized by the attention economy. And that's, I think that's one of the major reasons that we have this sort of such a massive global mental health crisis. I don't want to say that's the only reason, because there is also a reality of climate change and ecosystem collapse, which goes beyond that. But I think for our own experience, our experience of the world is so much mediated by what we see through our phones and through our screens. So I talk about how we believe, as we sit there with our telephone, we believe that we're looking through a window into the world, but we're not looking through a window into we're looking through a very carefully curated set of images that are, especially with the most recent iteration of the internet, which is filtering individualized content to all of us, which are designed by the algorithm to solicit the greatest emotional response possible. And we're losing that battle. I think I think the only way, if we don't engage in seeking to understand our own deep psychology, we further lose that battle. And the only chance that we have to regain some level of agency, is to understand the deep psychology that the algorithm has been training itself on against us for the last 15 years. And I think that's there's another author with the publisher that this book is published with, Revol, wrote a book a couple of years ago in which Mike Watson talks about how even our sleep is now bookended by social media. And so that's a part of my practice. Obviously, I write my dreams down every night, come back to them later in the day. I often don't know what I've written down until I come back to them. But a really important part of that practice for me is meditation before and after sleep, so that I'm no longer bookending my dreams with that algorithmically generated content.
Wow.
Yeah, and also too with the social media and news, it's all about fear, like and driving your fear or anger. Like almost like our worst human nature
Yeah, yeah,
emotions than love and
yeah,
inspiration and empowerment. And it's like if we don't pay attention, we can get it. It really affects our
yeah, yeah.
psychology, and we're
And
so conditioned,
yeah, no,
easily
I think
conditioned.
it's fear. But actually, I was talking to someone about this the other day, and I've got another aspect of it that we were trying to work out what was going on. We're trying to work out what was going on when you sit down in front of the TV of an evening and you haven't got a plan for what you're going to watch. And 40 minutes later, you're still scrolling through content and watching trailers, and you haven't settled on something to watch. And what's going on there? And in the same way, when you're looking through social media, you keep going through, and it's fear. But the thing that's driving that behavior is hope. You're hoping
Oh,
for something
yeah.
better.
Like
And
escape almost, right? You're looking for that. Yeah.
to put a kind of mythological bent on that, in the Greek pantheon, hope was what the gods gave us to torture us. It was the hope that was left at the bottom of Pandora's box, which was the thing
Mm.
that stopped us from killing ourselves. So,
Mm.
and so I think, and I think we need to kind of think about, the forces of the attention economy are mythological. That's the only way really to think about.
Yeah, they're very primal, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
So these companies, of course, they probably have psychologists kind of advising them on how to do this stuff.
Mm.
What can we do on our side, like on our end, right? We're in our work, we focus on practicality. What can people actually do today and start to think
Yeah,
about
yeah,
these
yeah.
things?
Well, one of the things that I found through writing the book, or one of the ideas that I alighted on, was um, shifting away from the anger and the fear that you spoke about, and this relates to my last book. My last book was about love, and about how do we find ways to love in this world where every relationship has become transactional or been gamified. And in this book, I mean, in my last book, I talked about finding non-transactional acts of care to enact in, and one of the things I talked about in my last book was care for the dying as a really important thing. It's one of the few areas of non-transactional care that we can give, because that person, by definition, can't give back to you. Although we obviously receive so much back when we do care. But in this book, in Radical Jung, I settled on grief. When we look at the world around us and we look at the sort of horrors that are projected to us through social media, what I try and do is just catch myself, just stop for a moment, for a 10-second meditation. Just stop, check in with yourself, and it's kind of it's one of those things where you actually almost have to do nothing. You have to just stop and have that kind of meditative moment and allow the grief to come, because
Mm.
what we're not doing when we're looking at social media is we're not breaking down in tears, which actually is that's the correct response.
Mm.
I found it incredibly empowering when faced with these kind of barrage of images, of allowing that grief to come through and finding calm
Mm.
when you allow that in.
Yeah, I think I've had tears. I remember
Mm.
when the the Jewish war, the Israel and Palestine, and seeing the kids and running in horror, and I'm like, oh my God, like I just cried just to some of
Yeah,
the images. And I think people are in their heads a lot when they're on social media and
yeah,
online, and they're not like in their bodies.
yeah.
I really think this is a great segue to your work with ecotherapy,
Mhm.
because I think, we're in our heads so much, we're disconnected from our bodies, but also disconnected from the earth and the
Yeah.
world. I mean, Rob and I are in DC right now. We're moving to Colorado because
Oh,
we
nice.
want to be back in nature
Yeah,
again. We're starved for that
yeah,
connection to nature. So I'd
yeah,
love to hear more about what you do and how people work. And I know there's like a Jungian kind of theme to your work
yeah.
with the ecotherapy.
Yeah, so and actually that's one of the sort of drivers that started me on the pathway of writing this book. Was so I work as an ecotherapist, and I suppose I'll just tell you what that means before then going
Mm.
into sort of the connection to the book. So in very simple terms, I take people out into the woods. They sometimes cry and they come out feeling better, but there's a bit more complexity to that. But I take people into the woods either individually or in a group, and we see what comes up to us from nature. So we'll stop and we'll listen to the birds. We'll engage all our different senses. I'll guide people in using different senses to experience the forest as fully as possible. And it's kind of magical that some of the people who've had the most profound effect clients that I've worked with have been people who've been in talking therapy for years, and then they come into the forest and they stop trying to find the answer, and the answers emerge for them.
Mm.
And that can happen, that either happens or generally happens kind of internally. And, I always say to people when we're doing this work is that it's not talking therapy. So you don't have to talk at all. But if you want to, we can discuss stuff. And if I give you an example of when it becomes kind of this, what I've mentioned before of sort of externalizing mind within nature, what happens with me particularly if I'm doing one-to-one individual therapy sessions and I go with someone and we normally go to the same part of the forest every time. We walk through the forest and we do these practices. They get to know the trees and the plants and the animals and this each session might be an hour and a half, 2 hours long. And what very commonly happens in these sessions is after I've had 2 or 3 sessions with someone, I'll then guide them into the forest. I'll then say to them, well, you can take us to the next place that you want to go to. And this extraordinary thing happens, and it happens frequently, where the client will become completely disoriented. They don't know which way to go. They're in a place that they're familiar with, and they're totally lost, and they panic. At which point I'm able to step in and say, well, that's why I'm here. I'm the guide, so it's okay. And we then start kind of walking through the forest and kind of, I'll allow them to intuitively go where they feel they ought to go. And it's extraordinary because even from my perspective, the forest is no longer a metaphor for mind. It becomes mind. And, and we have we'll walk through the forest and we'll come across different trees, different glades, different thickets, and they'll remind them of things that have happened in their past. And as they describe those things back to me, I'm there too. It's present. We're fully present with those things that have happened and are happening in the moment. And it's happened a few times, not as frequently as the general journey, but it's happened a few times that we then will work our way back and find a younger self in the forest. And I've had a few instances where the client has sort of said they're here, we found them. And I'll say, well, are you going to talk to them? And they'll be a bit sheepish, like, what, here? What? And I'll then kind of leave. I'll walk off a few meters away and just let them be with an aspect of themselves. And it's extraordinary. I mean, I'm sort of sending goosebumps down my spine as I think about it, and every time it happens, that it's just a quite extraordinary process. And as you said, yeah, getting out of people's heads, it is fully embodied. We're walking through, and the forest is present there with us. And I think it's, this is what I know in some of your podcasts, you sort of talk about neuroscience, and you were talking about it in the last one that I listened to on nightmares about this, when in a dream state, the brain is calm. It's not working so hard. And this sort of, I suppose all of these things relates to kind of ongoing research on psychedelics and on dream states, that when you get into these states, there is a breakdown of duality, and you end up, mind becomes the world and world becomes the mind, and there is no distinction. And I believe that's what's happening. I can only describe my experience. I don't know what's going on in someone's brain, but I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, that's interesting. The idea that we're alienated from nature, right, goes back to Jung, of course. And you're talking about kind of reconnecting an individual to that natural world that is kind of our natural home, right? And it essentially is psyche, because everything we're perceiving is our mind, because it has to be filtered through our perception, which then becomes an interpretation of what that nature.
And Jung, of course, Jung had to do this. He had to retreat to the tower and be on the edge of the lake, and he said, sometimes I feel that I am spread out across the landscape and in the changing of the seasons. And yeah, I think that's what I'm bringing people back to. And that, again, coming back to the book, that was the second part of your earlier question, was why I wrote the book, was that my training in ecotherapy, as with many of these kind of, sort of nature connection and more sort of new age modalities, borrows from a kind of pantheon of non-Western indigenous ideas, and I think that's fine as long as it's done with due respect, and we have to do that because we are so kind of broken and wounded in the West. But I sort of set out, before I knew I was going to write a book about Jung, I started sort of reading around and speaking to anthropologists and trying to work out why do we not have an indigenous nature connection in the West? And where do I find it? And so I started looking around, and I suppose the first question is, why do we not have this in the West? Is that we had the witch trials, and we terrorized the predominantly women, but some men, who were engaging in these kind of nature practices, who were living in the woods, who were offering kind of herbal and other
Right.
alternative solutions. And then, then I don't know exactly how I ended up on, I mean, I was already kind of interested in Jung personally, I suppose. And so that's where this comes in. And then I suppose I realized that as Jung wrote, that he very much talks about the fact that he's working with the evolution of mind and looking back at previous cultural states of mind. He says, through alchemy that he found a chain back to Gnosticism, and thus back to Hinduism. And so it feels like there's something very, well, for me, it connects a lot of my kind of, I suppose, methodological and metaphysical interests. My last book was quite heavily kind of engaging in sort of Hindu philosophy, but also, for me at least, offers something more coherent and cohesive for my own practice, whether that's for myself or with my clients as well. That there's this kind of there's a lineage to this now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like, well, our work, we base it on Eastern philosophy and the Western, because we feel like that's what's missing.
Mm.
With Jung's work, if you're just doing it as a therapist, it becomes more of a Western model of, fixing the person and
Yeah.
diagnosing the person. And this is more that we are all one, like the non-dual philosophy. We're one with everything. We're pure consciousness. All those ideas help us use Jung's work in a more profound way, because we aren't just fixing the little psyche of our personal life.
Yeah.
We're actually connecting to the bigger, more spiritual element
Yeah.
of who we are.
And
Yeah.
and that's also something that I wanted to, with Jung, address, and I address it up front in the book, that when you read Jung's autobiography, which I recommend to anyone that hasn't, it's fantastic. But then you get to the kind of final few chapters where he talks about what he's learned from his travels in Africa and in India and other places, and suddenly your sort of modern liberal self is careful what you're saying here. But there is there's much in that, and unfortunately it's in those chapters where he really starts engaging with the Tao and things like that. And but they're I mean,
The language he uses is sometimes not PC.
well, the language he uses,
Yeah.
obviously, but I'm going to go further than that, and I'm going to directly criticize him, because I think
Okay.
we have to.
Yeah.
I think we have to say that attitudes of care and respect to other people have always existed. So therefore, just because it's the style of the time to denounce someone or to dehumanize someone doesn't necessarily excuse it. I think we can understand it, but I think we ought not to excuse it. And so therefore we come back to the kind of, the age-old dilemma of should we be allowed to enjoy Wagner because he was a rampant anti-Semite? And I think, yes, absolutely, we should be allowed to, but we also need to reference the man as well. And I don't want to, in saying this, I don't want to totally denounce Jung as a man, because I think that many aspects of him are wonderful. And if anything, Jungian philosophy tells us that we all have a shadow, and we all must, recognize that there are problematic aspects of self. And I think it just makes him a more human character to have that side of him. But
Instead of making him a god and he's this,
absolutely, yeah,
like
and
put him on a pedestal. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the, if I had one criticism of just how Jungianism or Jung the field of Jung has developed, is that it can sometimes feel slightly religious. It does have a kind of religiosity to it. Certainly, if you look at sort of training through the Jung Institute and stuff like that, there are big barriers to entry and aspects of it that are slightly problematic, I would say.
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of hero worship going on. Yeah. So this other aspect of your work, kind of thinking about the climate and how or why we don't deal with it. Like, why is it not more important to us humans, since it's really our lungs and our whole health that we're talking about.
I think as individuals are mostly very, very troubled and bothered by it. I think we are disenfranchised by our political systems to give up. And I really struggle with. I mean, I do it, but I increasingly struggle with washing out a yogurt pot to put in the recycling as I'm watching, a year's worth of emissions being launched in missiles of an evening.
We're making our contribution, and the
it's
governments are just like
well,
wiping it
governments
out.
and 70 private planes flying into Davos every half hour or whatever it is. So that's problematic. But when you get, I mean, certainly, I don't know how much this has penetrated in the US, but in Europe particularly, and increasingly in the UK, there are emergent political parties that are very much working from the ground up with community assemblies, establishing what they care about and setting their policy. And those community assemblies are always radically defensive of the environment and the climate. And so then we need to ask, so what's happening if people are bothered by this? Then we need to look at what's going on. And I take an idea from, there's a brilliant book about the climate emergency called The Ministry of the Future. It's a novel by Kim Stanley Robinson. And he invents a pathology called Gotterdammerung syndrome. And Gotterdammerung syndrome is where he describes it as where powerful people, mostly men, fear the loss of their power. And they can't accept, I'm paraphrasing here, but they can't accept the loss of their power. And so for them, they would rather destroy the earth than lose their own power. And
well, the earth is the anima. It's the feminine.
Well, and I go into that with, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, has been saying recently that companies need more masculine energy. It's madness. I recently actually wrote an article about how this idea of all of these tech oligarchs who keep going on about masculine energy shows them to be fantastically immature, because in any other worldview, elderhood comes from integrating the other gendered aspect of yourself. So these men going around saying more masculine energy, they're demonstrating that they're children. But I think that what's going on, combining this with that Gotterdammerung syndrome, where these people are willing to destroy the earth, which they are with their data centers and everything else, I suggest in the book that the shadow that they are turning away from is their own privilege. And so if you look at what they do, is they end up acting horrifically and harmfully and violently against the least privileged among us. And I think that is because they have failed to address the shadow of their own privilege. So they end up saying that migrants have got these privileges because they're being, fallaciously suggesting they're being given, too much money is being spent on them, or too much money on, if you look at what was happening with Doge in the US, all this money on helping people who are underprivileged. And because the accusation being that those people were privileged from the most privileged men in the world, they're not facing something there. And I think it's their privilege, because to face in the world as we see it, to face their own privilege would be a horrific thing.
So this is like a collective shadow of the technology.
I think it's a shadow of these powerful men.
And think of the technology is very logic, the animus and the anima. And in the US, they're trying to take women's rights away to vote, and like they're trying to, take their right to choose and like not have women in power, like that kind of prejudice. I see it as where they're afraid, and it's like scared little boys instead of like they're so powerful. They're hanging on to like the old way of being. And I feel like they know it's the end. So I feel like the women are emerging, and it's just the illusion is that the men have power, but eventually women are going to save the world, as the Dalai Lama said, the Western women. But also the men getting into their own femininity. Like we work with the Jungian, integrating the anima in men would be very powerful.
And I think, I do write about this in the book. I think it's not just, we have to be careful not to say, the emergence of women to save the world, because from a Gnostic perspective, actually what saves the world is the primordial couple together.
Well, rebalancing.
And
emerging, like reclaiming.
And I think
like the original goddess was a woman, and then they kind of wrote her out, her out of the Bible and all that. And and so it's like, bringing her back up to
Yeah.
equal.
But being
Yeah.
careful, because actually, I mean, I was talking to a friend the other day who's an archaeologist about this, because there does seem to be, if we go back sort of from what we can see in the archaeological record over the last few thousand years, certainly so I live in Wiltshire. I was at 4 o'clock this morning, I was at Stonehenge for the equinox sunrise, because I live just down the road
Yeah.
from it. And so the landscape around here is full of Neolithic architecture, all like surrounding this. And it's interesting that you can see this kind of yo-yoing through the history of the raising up of the goddess and then the raising up of the masculine. And it seems to be something that kind of yo-yos. And I think therefore, we maybe need to think, if we're going to heal from this, is try not to swing the pendulum. We kind of need to keep the pendulum in the middle.
Well, I see a lot of women, I know like women entrepreneurs that kind of talk about like they're wannabe leaders, and they kind of denounce the patriarchy, and it like makes the men the enemy, which is not helpful at all, I don't
Yeah.
think, because just making the other the enemy is not really going to help. It's all about integration, and
Yeah.
it shows a fear in woman when they do that. So anytime you're like making the other person the enemy, there's something in you
Yeah.
that you have to look
And
at.
also, I think
Yeah.
with particularly that sort of example that you're using, and this is something that I called the book Radical Jung because for a number of reasons, but one of the radical things was trying to sort of take a slightly radical view of Jung's ideas. And one of those that I tried to unpick was Jung's appreciation of gender. And I think we need to, going off your example of the kind of entrepreneurial businesswoman who perhaps is behaving in quite a masculine way, that we don't necessarily, certainly when Jung was writing, it would have been expected that those kind of gendered attributes were tied to biological gender from the outset. And then you bring in the anima or the animus. And I think, like, firstly from kind of the experience and lived life of millions of queered lives now suggests that maybe is not the case. And interestingly, I've taken a note talking to friends recently that queer friends do actually seem to have a kind of reverse process of integration in that a sort of a queer man may be integrating a masculine aspect where you might have expected an anima. And so I think
that's what we found too. We have a lot of variety, even trans clients, and we always say, Jung came out with the woman has an animus and the man has an anima, and we're like, we don't know, like that was his time. It was very rigid Victorian times. And I love that idea, because I think people like want to preserve, like most Jungians want to preserve Jung stuff like the Bible, and we need to evolve it with our time. And our time is, we have to look at, these concepts are great, but they are very limiting to certain populations. And I saw that in your book when I was scanning through it. And we totally agree that we just say, like, if you're interacting with the anima, see what shows up. And sometimes we need animus energy. Sometimes we need anima energy. It's not about based on gender or identity.
Exactly that. And we need to, and the way I describe it is that what you're looking for is you're looking for the polarity to that which you already have understanding of. You're looking for the polarity of that.
Our students won't forgive us if we don't ask you more about the psychedelics.
Yes, they love the psychedelics.
And
so actually, the final chapter of the book is me describing a psychedelic trip. I've found personally, for me, psychedelics have been incredibly useful and healing for me. And I think, I just go with the kind of standard trope, which is that, having a full-blown psychedelic trip is like doing 100 hours of therapy. And I suppose that's maybe a bit too lazy, because it kind of has to come with the therapy. And what's been interesting for me was when I was much younger, I'm in my mid-40s now, when I was in my kind of late teens and 20s, then we would recreationally use psychedelics. And it was all kind of fun and sometimes scary and a bit crazy. And that was it. And then latterly, having gone through, a very classical Jungian sense, having gone through my midlife crisis and kind of hit the buffers and had to engage, start asking deeper questions of myself. As I've come to understand how to navigate this world of symbols, experiences that I had in psychedelic trips 20 years ago have suddenly gained meaning. So that's been kind of a, it's sort of a fascinating thing for me, that it was always there to discover, but it was always there to discover, but it needed the tools to understand it. So the person that I kind of talk about a bit, who's often forgotten about in the history of psychedelics, is that there was a British psychiatrist called Ronald Sanderson, and he was practicing. He had a correspondence with Jung, because he was a Jungian psychiatrist, and he was practicing in the UK in the 50s and 60s. And he was giving, whereas in the States, Timothy Leary and others were giving their students like massive doses of acid and kind of sitting down with rooms full of incense and kind of seeing what happens when you blow the doors off, kind of thing. Ronald Sanderson was giving people small doses of LSD and then having very long psychotherapeutic sessions, Jungian informed sessions, where there might be a bit of art therapy, there'd be a lot of talking therapy. And was having great results. And I wanted to kind of bring that back, because I suppose I found that, not in exactly the same way, but I found that my approach is most similar to what I subsequently read of him describing. And then the thing that actually really, in fact, it's here. This, I promise I didn't put this here as a prop. I was just working on it. But he wrote a book called Simon's Daughter, this is the only known copy that I know of, and I've been in touch with his widow to get the rights to it. So we're currently republishing this book, hopefully later this year. And it's a novel in which you'd love it from a Jungian sense, because he perfectly integrates dream experiences, psychedelic experiences, and daily life of his characters kind of seamlessly. And my understanding, this will come out when I write the introduction to it, but my understanding is that, and from talking to his widow, that what we're also reading when you read this book is we're reading his process of integration. This was his work to integrate.
Right.
And to speak to the psychedelic side of things, the reason that there aren't any copies of this, or one of the reasons, is that it was published in 1985 at the height of Reagan's war on drugs. And so a book that's got LSD written 3 or 4 times on the back cover was immediately buried, and no one really spoke about it. And so it's only now coming up that people are re-engaging with psychedelics and their healing potential, that it might be, of use. And actually, the reason I came to this is kind of quite serendipitous and speaks, I think, a little bit to the way that synchronicities happen and the mind is manifest in the world around us. I got to the point of writing this book or working on this book because I'd ordered a book of essays from a publishing company called the Psychedelic Press, in which one of the essays is about this book. And I ordered it online, and 10 minutes later, the author turned up on my doorstep with a copy of the book. And it turns out that he lives down the road from me. And it's another man called Rob, who writes books on psychedelics, that lives about 100.
There's a lot of Robs in
Yeah. And so we kind of took it from there. And we're now working on this book, which I think is going to be, I hope that people will read it, because it's, like we said before, to engage with Jung is to feel your way, and to engage in something kind of more mythological. And I think actually, not enough people have done this, but engaging it through it as a novel is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, because you're not learning, you're just immersing yourself in the story.
Exactly. Yeah.
I can see that the Jungian model would be ideal for helping people integrate their psychedelic experiences.
Completely. I think it is. This is to go off on a slight tangent, but I was thinking about it earlier. As I say, I'm an academic, and in my academic work, I have found a few years ago, my last book, which is called Love and the Market, it came out of, I ran a reading group at University College London for a book called The Philosophy of Meta-Reality, which is a book on metaphysics by a philosopher called Roy Bhaskar. And it's almost completely impenetrable, which is why I had to run a reading group for a year for us to kind of slowly work our way through this book. And having finished reading the book, I was talking to a friend who's also an author and an academic. I was talking to a friend, and he's someone who's interested in metaphysics, and we were talking about, as you do on WhatsApp, the nature of consciousness. And I typed something that was kind of related to this reading group that we'd had, and this was me on a kind of Friday morning, completely sober, and I suddenly had a bang, sort of St. Paul on the road to Damascus non-dual experience, where everything that I looked at was consciousness. Consciousness preceded materiality, and it was pretty terrifying. It would have been horrifying if I didn't have an understanding of this world kind of academically. But what was interesting for me in that is that I had intellectually got myself to that point. I'd done it through thinking, and similarly with my ecotherapy work, as I've sort of taken I guess a more, to use the word very loosely, but a more kind of shamanic approach to healing, that I've, strange things happened. I've developed a relationship with birds and other animals, and strange things happened.
I know there's a bird in your profile picture.
Yeah, well, so the last 2 books that I've written, the moment that I've shut my laptop, having finished the final chapter, and I've gone out for a walk up the hill behind our house, on both occasions I've had profound encounters with crows and ravens. The last one, the picture of the bird in the book, was so it was about a year ago. Went out for a walk and discovered a fledgling crow that had fallen out of a nest, and I left it because I was hoping its parents were still looking after it. Went back 24 hours later and it was still there, and I watched it for an hour. Its parents weren't following it, so I brought it home and kept feeding it. And we had this crow, Mr. Crowley, living with us for the last year, and it was extraordinary. He would fly off and join his flock, and then would come back. I'd be 2 miles away from here with a client or an ecotherapy group or on a picnic, and he'd fly out of the sky and land on my shoulder, and then go back to his mob. And it was just quite extraordinary. And of course, for Jung, and with his research into alchemy, the crow or the raven are the symbol of the nigredo, the midlife crisis in modern money. And so I've had this extraordinary experience for the last few years. There were other crows before that, but I've had a few years while I've been going through this kind of constantly accompanied by crows, particularly this Mr. Crowley character, who every morning I'd go out to the back doorstep of my house with my coffee, and he'd land on my shoulder, and I'd feel like a hero. And so there's a tragic ending to this, that a few months ago, he landed on an electricity junction box and was zapped. And I think this kind of comes full circle to your questions about how do we deal with social media and this kind of and climate change and everything like that, is that the world is symbolic. So while I did grieve and I cried when the crow died, and my kids cried when the crow died, it was also a relief, because that was, the nigredo was over. The crow had been killed. And I think that feels to me to be a really strong foil to the nature of the world, to the attention economy, to being overwhelmed by climate change and war, is to understand the world symbolically. Because when we do, we can gain some distance from it, and we're no longer just a pinball to our emotions.
And we feel more connected when we see, what is this event happening? What does that correspond to me? And we see everything less heavy.
Yeah.
And through our ego, and we see things through our higher consciousness, and this kind of connectedness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You're speaking our language.
And death is the symbol of transformation.
Absolutely.
So it is the transformation of the shadow energy into the potential.
And it makes the world feel more numinous. We're
absolutely
engaged with this magical part of life. And
there does have to be space for magic. There's got to be some unknown. Otherwise, what's the point? There was another fantastic thing with the crow, which I think does speak to sort of some aspects of shadow, is that in the village that I live in, there's obviously kind of a local village WhatsApp group where everyone kind of scores are fought and lost and settled and stuff like that. And while this crow was flying around the village, which was now familiar with humans, it was befriending other people. And most people thought this was great. But there are a handful of people who constantly complained that were complaining about the crow and were being attacked by the crow and da, da, da. But they were all people who had a grievance with me. So the crow, and again, this is maybe part of the reason why it's such.
The crow was like doing your work for you.
Yeah, so the crow was innate, was a blank slate for them to project onto.
Sure.
but brilliantly meant the lived experience of the village that my crow was attacking my enemies.
Well, I mean, we could talk to you forever. I'm really excited to dive more into your book. We will put your book, The Radical Young, in the show notes for people that want to find it. And also right now it's a waiting list, but it will be coming out in May, the end of May.
Yes, yeah. You can pre-order it now.
Okay, great. Well, it really is filled with you cover a lot of topics, so very rich. We just touched on them today, but we really appreciate you coming on.
Absolutely.
Well,
Thank you.
thanks so much for your work, and thanks so much for having me on to have the conversation.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.